this attention to data, to M&E is absolutely essential. And I look forward to the 2 reports that are being released as part of this discussion today. I think it's also significant that the World Bank and Plan International, who have very important lessons learned from their wide experience, are part of this discussion and bringing those experiences and that research to this seminar as well. And as I look out, I see so many of you who've blazed the trails, just so to speak, in this work, and know that we're grateful to all of you, because it is being able to base one's work on a strong evidence-based case that makes all the difference in successful projects and programs and policy especially. Now, it seems to me that it wasn't that long ago where we rarely heard the words M&E, indicators, and impact. I was invited to speak to a board meeting not too long ago for a global NGO, and much of the discussion that they were having focused on the need to be responsive to the demands of measurements and evaluation. Not only because donors today were requiring it, and obviously that's an important factor, but they were also realizing as an organization that they needed to better understand the impact of their programs over the long term. So there is a new consciousness, and this discussion is just way ahead of the curve, but that consciousness is fortunately growing. Early on in my job at State, I learned that I was responsible for a report to Congress. I didn't quite know how this happened, but the report was due momentarily, and it was about the effectiveness of USAID programs on Afghan women in the areas of economic and political empowerment. And I asked around, well, was the basis of this report done? Did we have something for me to look at? And I soon learned that there was a draft report prepared, and I was able to give a big sigh of relief. But then as I look through this massive tome, I was shocked at the report material. It was confined solely to outputs. So every single presentation of every program was the number of people trained and what they were trained in. There was absolutely nothing in the entire report on outcomes of programs, many of which had been in place for years and years. There certainly was the capacity to be able to look and see which of these programs were actually making a difference. So I went through that process. Blessedly, the report went to the Hill, and there wasn't a whole lot said after that. But then I'm in a discussion with a group of grant recipients in a program that we were overseeing that had to do with Iraq, and the same arena of consideration on women's economic and political empowerment. And I asked the grant recipients, we were having a discussion around a conference table, I asked what I thought were very basic questions. Were jobs procured by the women who were participating in these training programs? No response. Were they able, after these interventions, to demonstrate growth in their agency, greater control over their lives? And I got nothing but blank stares, as if no one had asked these basic questions before. So this is what we're coming from in some ways. And yet, at SEWA, the self-employed women's association in India that I think many of you are familiar with, that has couple of million women organized, the poorest of the poor, who are now engaged in tremendously successful economic programs. We asked a simple rag picker who was among a group of women I first met with when I accompanied Hillary Clinton as First Lady, what difference SEWA had made, what difference that intervention had made in her life. And she stood up, and I have never forgotten this. This was 20 years ago. She said, "I am no longer afraid. I am not afraid of the police. I am not afraid of my husband. And I am not afraid of my mother-in-law. And in India, that is true empowerment, not to be afraid. Now, this is hardly technical, scientific, to be sure, but it is a clue to the bigger difference these kinds of programs can make to what was achieved in this single woman's life. And it is no small challenge that we have to invest in data collection. We have to invest in what is required to do good M&E, and to understand why this process is not a nuisance, but a necessity. And I know for far too many who are engaged in this field, it is very difficult to get the resources, because the feeling is, just go do the program. It doesn't matter that this program may not be having the impact that's desired. It doesn't matter that it could be so much more effective. Just do the program. Why should we be investing in M&E? And that is not the way, obviously, that we need to look at this. For me, women's economic empowerment is crucial. I have often described it as the portal through which women can realize their rights and make progress on a wide range of development goals. Economic empowerment brings benefits to her and to her family. It makes her far more confident. It expands her skills. It often decreases violence against her, and it leads to greater engagement in the life of her community. You can't go on and close the gap in women's political participation or any number of other things if a woman is not economically empowered. It also enables her to be more effective in standing up for her rights. In short, it is one of the most powerful ways to enable women to achieve their potential. We also know that the analysis of progress that has been taking place on the MDGs over the last 15 years and the contraction in poverty, what those reductions are and to what they can be attributed. We know in great measure it has been economic growth that has contributed significantly to the decline in poverty. And certainly that's true above all in China, also in India. Poverty would be 30% higher in Latin America were it not for women's economic participation. So this matters. This matters greatly. And that's the first thing I want to say to all of you today. Keep at it, because its significance is so profoundly important. When I met with a group of women who have endured some of the worst sexual violence imaginable in the conflict in the DRC, where rape continues to be the strategic tool of their war strategy, the women told me that they wanted to go from pain to power. And when they said power, they were not talking about the kind of power most of us are familiar with. They wanted power over their lives. And they described that power to me as having a market, a simple market. And today, in the whole security discussions that are going on over reparations, because there's been so little accountability for sexual impunity and conflict, the discussion now on reparations centers around economic empowerment. What can be done, not in terms of monetary reparations or other kinds of justice outcomes, as important as they are, but what can happen to lift those women, raise them up back on their feet through the means that will have the greatest impact: an economic livelihood, an economic opportunity. Today, thanks to many of you in this room and others who are not here, we have a plethora of data that correlates women's economic participation with economic growth, with jobs creation, with inclusive prosperity. We can fundamentally transform our economies. It's a win-win for companies who want to expand their talent pool, their markets, their bottom line. It provides enormous benefits to all of society. It's not just a women's issue. It's an issue for everybody. And the gender guidance that Secretary Clinton promulgated when she was secretary to implement the strategic imperatives articulated in the QDDR. Remember that the Defense Department had always done this quadrennial defense review, and it was the first time under her leadership that there was a review on diplomacy and development. That is being continued by Secretary Kerry. In fact, they're in the midst of that now. That guidance contained a whole section on monitoring and evaluation. And it noted that bureaus and embassies will integrate sex disaggregated data and gender indicators into monitoring and evaluation criteria. And it underscored that USAID was to develop new gender-related output and outcome foreign assistance indicators for annual reporting. And that imperative continues to this day, and it has been enhanced, and it has been more significantly integrated. Now, this represents a paradigm shift. For those of you who are young in this room, you may not realize what some of these changes actually represent. But it is a paradigm shift in many ways. From merely stating, as we often have, and rightly so, that it is the right thing to do, fundamental as rights are, we have been working to create that evidence-based case which demonstrates how it is both the smart and strategic thing to do. And I can tell you that if you can demonstrate the strong connections, the strong correlations, and create that case, you're going to have a much more robust, sound public policy. So sound public policy really needs this. Another paradigm shift has been related to this growing collaboration between government, the private sector, and civil society, much of what you see in the sponsorship of this discussion today. It is a collaboration of a multilateral organization, of a private sector company, of civil society actors, NGOs. This is the way that we can make greater progress when we work together. And it's all the more reason that this discussion is important because business is accustomed to measuring outcomes. The bottom line matters, and when we can come together with our resources, with our expertise, with our competencies, we are going to have a greater impact. So I confess that I don't come before you today as an expert, as most of you are, but I certainly come to you as an advocate because I have seen firsthand what a difference this work makes, both in public policy and in terms of how it impacts so many whose lives are significantly enhanced by virtue of this work. I have worked closely with many in the private sector, companies that have been involved in public-private partnerships, many of which we grew and supported during our time at the State Department, and that work also continues. In the We America program, Women's Economic Empowerment, that was announced at the Summit of the Americas, we recognize that one intervention alone will not always create the kind of outcome desired to grow successful women-run and owned enterprises. And in that case, the Inter-American Development Bank was a partner because access to capital is so important. Walmart and WeConnect were partners because being able to have a market for your services and products and to grow that market are all important. So expansion of markets is critical. ExxonMobil, Vital Voices, and so many others came together on training and mentoring. And the test will come over time as both the outputs and outcomes are evaluated. But from all we know, these are crucial kinds of interventions. And many of the companies today, whether Coca-Cola in its 5x20 program to create 5 million new entrepreneurs along its value chain, whether it's the kind of work that Walmart is doing in its enormous women's economic investment program. All of these programs are predicated on a very strong monitoring and evaluation platform. In fact, I've been familiar with many of them from the outset. And the discussion about how we are going to measure, how we are going to evaluate, how we are going to know we're on the right track, how we are going to know that we're actually meeting our goals was part of the discussion at the very beginning. And the experts were put in place and the strategies were put in place so that that kind of work will have the greatest impact that one wants to see. And it's not a whole lot different from when the CEO of ExxonMobil put so many resources, urged that resources be put behind explaining why, understanding that powerful multiplier effect of investing in women. What he wanted to know accounted for the double dividend. What really worked? Why? How could it be replicated? How could it be scaled? Do these programs make a difference over years? Clearly, this is not an easy process. It is, however, a necessary one. There are so many critical questions. There are so many variables. How in the evaluation process can we show that women's power actually increased? How is agency and voice measured? What is the role of the enabling environment in her success? What barriers, whether cultural, legal, or regulatory, or others, when they are removed, what difference does that make? What kind of change does it bring? How can we better capture the many dimensions of economic empowerment beyond income generation alone? Many of you are familiar with the full participation report that Secretary Clinton and the Gates Foundation put together looking at the progress that had been made over the last 20 years since the Fourth World Women's Conference that took place in Beijing. And as part of that looking back, looking at the data, looking at what progress has been made, there was a looking forward at the unfinished agenda. And in that looking forward, one of the key principles for action that was laid out was to measure results. And it was stated this way: disaggregating data is vital to smarter, more strategic investments that will improve programs, influence policy, and ensure accountability for results. And that's what we all want. We want smarter, more strategic investments. We want investments that will make a difference in the lives of women and their families. And that's the difference that you continue to make, what you do every day and what you will do as a result of this extraordinary convening. So thank you for all that you have done, and thank you even more for what you will do in the future.